How we going, Mr. Music? Right. I was going through some books and whatnot. I had to do a talk for a community group late last year, and when I was doing the talk, it sort of brought home a few I don't know, not so kind messages in some respects. One of those messages was, I think I've been chasing frogs for far too long, because what I realised was that when I was talking to this group, when I first started getting interested in frogs and that, the only book that was available at the time was a little thing that Denzi Klein had put out. And I got it out the other day and counted up how many frogs are actually described. And there were 52 described species of frogs in Australia at the time. Now, of course, now we're up to nearly 250. So things have changed dramatically, from when I started. And then I started to think back, well, what else was it like? And then I thought, oh, that's right. If you got a little, start off, tree frogs. All tree frogs were hyla. And that was that. There was no argument about it. You didn't worry about any genera and stuff like that. They were all hyla. Everybody was a hyla. And we only had about a dozen species of hyla anyway. A lot of the species that look a bit similar, of course, weren't distinguished, despite the fact that a lot of them had different calls. No one separated them. For the little mud frogs, if they were about that size, didn't matter what else they looked like, they were Crinia. If they were bigger than that, they were Limnid nasties, didn't matter what they looked like. And about the only other frogs we had at the time were the Cyclorana. Now, the Cyclorana had been described as Cyclorana, but of course they were clearly burrowing frogs, so they were put in with the Crinia and the Limnid nasties, weren't they? Nobody realised they were actually a modified tree frog, but anyway, that sort of came around later on. So, just as I say, when I started to think back about it, I just realised just how much things had changed just in the time that I've been mucking around with frogs. So, there's really has been quite a significant revolution going on in frogology in Australia. So I thought, well, maybe it's not a bad idea then to go right back to square one and start from the beginning and work my way right through and put a more balanced picture on what's actually happened in the discovery of frogs in Australia. So this is my attempt to do it. So we'll have a go. Right, so let's go. All right, well, who frogged first? I don't think there's any question about it. The Aboriginals went hands down, right? They would have been well and truly aware of the frogs way before any European even knew that Australia existed. Now, Aboriginals used frogs in a number of different ways. They certainly did use them for food, but they also used them as indicators. And we know they used them in several different ways as indicators. For instance, they were aware of the obvious thing. With some of the frogs, they're aware of approaching weather changes because they'll start calling. So any of you who have kept green tree frogs will know that, green tree frogs are terrific at doing that. As soon as you start to get a big drop in air pressure, the green tree frogs just go off, right? Well, the Aboriginals noted that about 40,000 years ago. So they would listen out for frogs, for what frogs were doing, because the frogs would tell you what's actually happening in the weather patterns. And if you're a bit inland, knowing when it's going to rain and where it's going to rain that's a mighty handy thing to know. And so if you're in a tribe and your frogs start calling, generally what you would do is you would spread that message to the others around you. You would very quickly spread the word. My frogs are calling, which means everybody starts coming to you because the waters are going to come. So the frogs were very important. They were not trivial beings in any sense of the word. The other thing they realised is that frogs are also really, really good indicators of clean water. And of course, we only cottoned on to that fact in the 1970s and 1980s when we got into the whole global pollution concept. So there's a lot of interesting stories in Aboriginal Dreamtime legends about frogs and early beings, coming across devil spirits sites where the water is foul and rank and there are no frogs. Whereas, if they climb their way out of the devil area and they come into the cleaner areas, then the frogs are there. So the frogs were, the frogs just featured over and over and over again. For some of the desert tribes, of course, frogs often meant the difference between life and death, particularly during severe droughts, the really, really bad droughts, because the Aboriginals realised that a number of the frogs were water-holding frogs, and in some cases that is the only water. And so when conditions get really, really bad, that's the water that you live off. It kills the frog, but it keeps you alive. Now, I don't know, it's a story I often tell people, but I don't know how many have ever read Sturt's diary of his trip to Cooper's Creek. When Sturt was one of those who attempted to do the search for the great inland sea when they thought there was a great big inland sea in Central Australia. And so he took off for Central Australia with a boat looking for the inland sea. And of course he just went across thousands of miles of desert and all the rest of it, and eventually they chucked the boat away and thought, this is just stupid. But the interesting thing with Sturt was that he took a couple of Aboriginals with him. Now at the time, that was actually revolutionary in itself, because all of the explorers before him did not use Aboriginals at all. They distrusted Aboriginals and generally regarded them as lower beings and so on, and so generally avoided them. Sturt, on the other hand, did take some Aboriginals with him. Admittedly, they were coastal Aboriginals, so they couldn't speak the lingo of the people when they got further inland, but they could gesticulate and generally get their message across. So everything's fine. Sturt and his men all load up their wagons. They took sheep with them. They took herds of sheep with them that they were going to butcher along the way. They took cattle. They took all sorts of things. Not surprisingly, they didn't get very far before the cattle and the sheep scattered, and they were out of that. And their main food supply from then on was corned beef. They had barrels of this corned beef sitting in fetid vinegar and salt. Now you can imagine after 3 to 6 months, corned beef sitting in the outside on these wagons was pretty rank, but that's your food. They had trouble finding any other food. They get the odd kangaroo, but really they struggle for their food really, really badly. The same with their water. They realised they had to cart water with them as well. So on their wagons they had barrels of water, and the only barrels they had, of course, were the barrels that the corned beef was in. So the water was yucca, right? Anyway, the Aboriginals who were going with them just simply refused right from day one to have anything to do with their food and anything to do with their water. It was foul. They weren't going to eat it. Let those silly white people eat that muck. We're not going to eat that muck. So, and Sturt was sort of amused by this, but as they're going through the greener country, it wasn't an issue. You could see that they were hunting and getting food, and there were plenty of creeks, they were getting water, so there's no trouble. When they got further inland, of course, things started to get a bit different, because yes, there was a little bit of food around still, and of course the Aboriginals were prepared to eat the reptiles and so on the land, whereas the Europeans weren't. But he was starting to get a bit worried about where on earth they were getting their water from. There was no water. There was no free water. And this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And yet the Aboriginals were fine, whereas his guys were in bad shape because they're drinking this foul, salty water out of the corned beef barrels. Right? So anyway, Sturt eventually, having the curious minds, thought they must have a secret supply or something. There's got to be some way they're getting water that we don't know about. So anyway, he started following these guys, particularly at night, because each night these guys would slope off in the dark and disappear for a while and then come back again. So Sturt started following them. And in his diary, I forget the date of this now, but you can look it up if you ever get onto any of the facsimiles of his diary. He records one night seeing something so bizarre that he had no idea what it was, totally misinterpreted what he understood, what he'd seen. And it's really interesting to read it, because what Sturt's seen was he's seen 2 Aboriginals creeping off through the dark, through the bushes, and eventually they worked their way down to a bit of a dry water course. And it was quite a bright moonlit night, so he could sit in the bushes back there and just sort of watch what was going on. And he describes a dance. They started to do this dance. And he described the dance as consisting of them walking in circles with their head down and every now and then doing this. Right? And he thought, this is a peculiar dance. Anyway, they do that for a little while, and then all of a sudden one will go, hiya! And they both get down on his haunches, dig, 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 dig. And then in the moonlight, you see one stand up and water would start flowing into his mouth. Right? And then they go back, they pat the ground again, they start dancing again. So, and that's how he described it. He couldn't think of what else it could possibly be. It was some sort of weird dance that produced water out of their hands. Right? So it's fantastic. Now, of course, we're smarter. We know what they were doing. What they'd done, of course, is they got down to an old dry watercourse. They looked for an area where the last of the rainwaters would have percolated. And then what they did was they disturbed the ground surface. And what they were trying to do was to expose the top of the burrows of the burrowing frogs. So they're disturbing the surface. And once they found it, of course, then they dig. And they go down, they grab the burrowing frog, because the burrowing frog's taken all of his water with him, and it's clean water. They grab the frog, they squeeze it, they break the lymph sacs. You get a cup of water, and it's clean water. Now, it's bad news for the frog, of course, but it keeps you alive. Right? So Sturt, as I say, had absolutely no idea. Even when he died, he still had no idea what had actually happened, what he'd seen. But you know, yeah, and the Aboriginals weren't going to tell him. No, blow that. Right, well, next one. And again, just to reiterate this, just how important frogs were for Aboriginals, they appear in Dreamtime stories regularly. And there's only, the one I guess that people might have heard of is the story of Tidlik. You know Tidlik? Well, Tidlik is actually the European version of his name. It's actually, his correct name is Gurukman. If you run his correct name, it's nothing like Tidlik, is it? So it's Gurukman. So, and Tidlik was used to explain why Central Australia dried up. Now, in Aboriginal collective memory, they know that over the 40,000 odd years they've been there, that Western Division has dried out. So the Aboriginals were there when Willandra Lakes were large bodies of water. The same with Mungo and all those areas. They were large bodies of water full of fish and waterfowl and flamingos and all those sorts of things, right? And they've seen them dried up. So something's happened. So what was there that could have taken the water away? Well, the only thing that's there now that has water are the burrowing frogs, and they're full of the water. So what could have taken such a massive amount of water away? It had to be a great big one of these burrowing frogs, and it had to be a greedy one, because one day it went up there and it soaked up all of the water out of all of these lakes, and everything went dry. And then the frog was going to bury himself in the ground. But everybody got concerned because now it was desert everywhere or other, and they needed the water back. And so they got the eel to dance in front of the frog, and the frog thought it was so funny that he started to laugh, and of course he spilled water out and managed to refill some of the lakes and so on. But he still took a lot of the water with him when he went away. So that was Tidlik. But there's all sorts of, the other one that's really interesting, which you don't see translations of very often, is the story about the lyrebird and the frog. And this is a really interesting one because the frog part of the story focuses on the ability to transform. And this is all about you going from a tadpole into a frog. But in the Dreamtime version, it goes beyond that to eventually becoming a lyrebird. And this is just this beautiful mimicking creature, and you can't tell its ancestry at all from what it was in the beginning. And that's, you know, it's an interesting analogy of the life cycle of a frog, but it's done, you know, through these other versions. And then you get other things like the crocodile story. You know, the Aboriginal woman who, in mythology, is walking across through a tribe, a neighbouring tribe's land where she's not supposed to go, and she's been warned not to go, because not only is the tribe hostile, but it's a dangerous land, and she gets attacked by a crocodile when she's in there. And she does all sorts of things to try and escape from the crocodile. She tells it all sorts of things. She promises it all sorts of things. But in the end, and you might think this is strange, but in the end, the way she survives is by giving birth to frogs. Now, the analogy of this is all about the business of being on land and being on water at the same time. Because if the crocodile had grabbed her and dragged her into the water, she would have died. Where if she is part frog, right, she'll survive in both environments. And so the whole notion was that if she could be amphibious, right, she would survive. So there's all this stuff all through Aboriginal legends. It's just amazing. Frogs feature very, very common. And so obviously they weren't just a curiosity there at all. The Aboriginals regarded them as obviously a lot more significant than that. And so you do find paintings of frogs all around the place. This is just one of the photos I took when we were up at Jabiru the last time. Just on one of the rock walls, you get a nice tree frog painting slapped up on the wall there. So yeah, so you get all sorts of things. Really, really good. Anyway, move on. All right, Europeans turn up, right? So they think they're going to sort everything out. They're going to classify everything. They're going to catalogue everything. Okay. The first Europeans who started to show an interest in natural history tended to do so in a fairly opportunistic way. Now, these often were people who were not dedicated naturalists, but they were just people on vessels at the time who had a stray interest in natural history. So as far as frogs goes, we really don't get much of a record until 1790, when the first frog is formally described. Now, there are drawings and paintings of frogs done by the Dutch much earlier than this, but the Dutch weren't collecting specimens. They certainly did paintings. They thought these things were ugly, in particular. The Heliopterus, they thought they were the most hideous things they'd ever seen in their lives. Couldn't understand why God would have created something like this. But they painted them because they just thought they were so bizarre. But yeah, just ignored them. They weren't collecting specimens or anything like that. So the first specimen that we see that's described was described by White in 1790, and White was not a historian, he was a surgeon. Right? He's just a medico, and he's wandering around and he just thought these things were nice. He thought the green tree frogs were good. And so he put a couple in a jar, sent them back to England and France to be described. And eventually they were described, not as Latoria, as a different genus, but as Cerealia. And I think most of you have got a good formal education, would realise straight away that Cerealia doesn't mean green, it means blue. So was he colourblind? Well, White didn't really describe it. When White sent the original specimens back, he only wrote 2 or 3 lines about what the frog actually looked like. The formal description was done back in Europe about 4 years later. And that specimen had been sitting in alcohol for 4 years before it was received. Yes, so it looked somewhat different. And we'll talk about the blue frog shortly. Okay, now the type specimen, sadly, that first frog that was actually collected no longer exists, because that specimen ended up in the College of Surgeons in London, and unfortunately it got hit by a bomb during World War II, and so that was the end of that specimen. Right? So that one went. Great tragedy. All right, next one. Probably the thing that puzzled me a little bit about when you read about some of the early explorers and settlers and stuff, was that they generally ignored frogs holus bolus. They weren't like the Aboriginals. They tend to just couldn't see the value in frogs at all. Whereas things like birds and mammals were different, and the main interest in birds and mammals was whether or not you could eat them. Right? So they were a food source. So when you get into the first animals being described from Australia, they were birds and furry things, and the reptiles and the frogs really were pretty much overlooked. Next one. All right. 1795. Okay. So Shaw has come across this frog. He has a look at it. He's clearly not impressed. I'll just read it for those of you who might have trouble reading that. It says, "An animal certainly cannot be numbered amongst the most beautiful of its genus. It is a species, however, that has never before been described, and is more peculiar from the circumstance of it being a native of the distal region of New Holland. Now, the distal region of New Holland is Western Australia, okay, which has added so many zoological treasures to the cabinets of natural history. Its rarity must therefore apologise for its deformity. Now, the species he's talking about a Helioporus here. The species he's talking about is not rare. In fact, it's as common as anything. He just had no idea how to find them. And as for its appearance, obviously, he wasn't impressed at all. So, all right, let's go on. So that was one of the first descriptions in the field of Australian frogs. So it's pretty impressive. So let's come back to the blue frog. The blue frog really gains fame when Napoleon takes the crown in France. Now, you probably, if you know any of your Napoleonic history, you probably know that Napoleon had a bit of a fascination with Australia, and as did various other European leaders, because this was the antipodes, this was the other side of the world, and people were now starting to come back and describe all these weird and stupid things that really shouldn't exist. So they talk about the duck-billed water mole, I mean, what a stupid animal, that can't possibly exist. And then somebody says, but this thing lays eggs. Well, that's even stupider again, isn't it? And then they come back and they say there's ferns here that are taller than a man. There's grasses here that are way taller than a man. Now, come on, what's going on? This is not right. There's something terribly screwy going on around this place. Anyway, the first frog that went back to London, of course, was the good old green tree frog. But as I say, it ended up going back in this rotten old bottle of alcohol and wasn't taken out of the alcohol jar for many years later. And the problem is that green tree frogs have a number of pigments in their skin. And one of those pigments they have is xanthan, which is a yellow pigment, which is highly alcohol soluble. So the curators should have been suspicious that the alcohol had gone yellow in the jar, because when they change the alcohol, they pour all the yellow pigment off. And what you end up with, when you take all the yellow pigment out of a green tree frog, you end up with a blue frog. So in the description, it became Latoria cerealia, the blue frog. Now, when Napoleon heard about this amongst all of the other weird and wonderfuls from Australia, he said, I want blue frogs for Malmaison, which is where he and Josephine lived. He wanted blue frogs in the ponds and the fountains to adorn Malmaison. And so he sent expeditions to Australia to collect blue frogs. And those expeditions came here a number of times. And they didn't like to have to go home until Napoleon. we looked and all we could find were green ones. We couldn't find. Now, I guess the ironic part about all of this is there is actually a blue version of the green tree frog, which occurs up in the Atherton region of North Queensland. But of course, nobody had actually found that version of it at that stage. So poor old Napoleon kept sending his boats down here to collect the blue frogs for Malmaison, and they were looking for something that didn't exist. Next one.
Further out west too, in New South Wales.
Yeah. Okay. Now the French we should take big note of here, because in the early history of Australia, the English in particular, and most notably Gould, led the charge in describing a lot of the mammals and the birds. And so really, I don't know whether it was by default or some sort of gentleman's agreement or whatever, but the the French and then later on the Germans basically took it upon themselves to start describing the reptiles and the frogs. So the French take to the seas. 1766, Louis de Bougainville did his first voyage around the world, and he was deliberately told to stop at Australia and to collect. Okay. Now, he didn't stop here long, because in those days, England and France weren't getting on terribly well, and so everywhere he went, he kept running into English boats, and so they'd hurl abuse at each other, maybe fire the odd cannonball at each other, and generally move on. So he didn't get much of a chance to do a lot of collecting in Australia. About, nearly 15 years after that, La Perouse set off. And he was instructed specifically by Napoleon, you get me those blue frogs, or don't come back, sort of. Well, he didn't come back. His ship ran aground in the Solomons, and the whole expedition perished. So yeah, he didn't make it. We don't have any idea what sort of collecting was done by La Perouse in Australia. We know he stopped in Tasmania. We know he stopped at various points along the east coast. So you can guarantee he probably would have had a ship full of specimens. But of course, all of that was lost. The first time the French really get a chance to do some serious collecting is when Nicolas Baudin does his famous trip around the world. And so he spent a lot of time in the South Seas and particularly around Australia, and he had a dedicated naturalist with him by the name of Francois Perron. Now, Perron is a name, of course, that some of you will be quite familiar with because it pops up in the Australian frog literature a lot. Now, also with Perron was an artist. Now, by this stage, they'd learnt their lesson that if you're collecting specimens, putting them in pickling jars for years, and then taking them back to England, they'd understood that changes would occur in the specimen. So they took artists along to draw the animal as it was before it went in the pickling jar, and then that diagram would go with the specimen back to whoever would do the formal description, and hopefully they would get something closer to the real description of the animal. And the artist on this particular occasion was Charles Alexandre Lesueur. Again, another name that pops up fairly regularly in frogology. So Perron and Lesueur were, actually they pronounce it Lesueur, but anyway, were great mates. They got on really, really well. The Baudin voyage had lots of difficulty. Baudin died. He never made it back to France. Perron got back just. He was invalided for about 4 years before he could actually start working on the collections when he got back to France. Lesueur got out of it reasonably well, but only about a third of the original crew made it back to France alive. So difficult, but at least he got his specimens back and they were able to actually start formally describing a lot of the material they had. The next French endeavour was de Freycinet, who was also sent on a voyage around the world and told to spend a bit of time snooping around Australia because those rotten pommies were setting up these camps and establishments all around the place. So de Freycinet thought he'd fix them. So he would find parts of the New Holland coastline that the British hadn't claimed, and he would claim them for France, which he did. So he claimed Victoria for Napoleon. He planted the French flag, and that was formerly known as Napoleon Land. Okay? Now, the only reason that the French didn't come back and contest that claim was the French Revolution came straight on the top of this. So they were not going to send troopers down here to fight the British over this claim for New Holland. The troops were needed at home to protect the castles and protect Napoleon and protect the royalty. They were in big trouble back at home. And then the next one after that was Duperrey, who also was sent on a voyage around the world, and he spent about 9 months all up in Australia collecting specimens and taking them back to France. So a lot of stuff is going back to France now to be described. All right, next one. Okay, we should talk about Perron because he's really significant in this. Apart from being the first one to do an intense collection within Australia, his collection was the biggest by far to ever come out of Australia, and he took back nearly 100,000 specimens. Right? Now, he was a serious collector. So he had enough wit about him to know you don't just take one of everything, you try and get the variants as well. So this guy had a sense of variation within species and across species. So he was very good. And so not surprisingly, you know, through the, not only in the froggy world, but in the reptile world, you'll see Perron's name just comes up over and over and over again. He was pretty good. Now, that's not him naming them after himself. That's somebody else naming them after him. He never named anything after himself. Okay, next one. So, 2 more names that perhaps you might be familiar with, Dumeril and Biberon. Okay. Now, these guys, unlike Perron, never came to Australia. These guys were just straight zoologists. They were museum bods, if you like. And these are the guys who were sitting back in France when each time one of these trips from around the world comes back, they start unloading the cases, sort it out, describe it, what is it? And so they spent between them about 50 years just trying to catalogue, sort out and describe the various frogs and reptiles and stuff that was coming back from New Holland. So you find both Biberon and Dumerel's names start popping up in the literature as well. Both of them were very, very good anatomists of the day. No, we won't worry about that. Keep going. Next one. Okay. It's not until about the 1840s that you start to get any information at all about, from the explorers and natural historians, about Aboriginals using frogs. Now, prior to that, I mean, Sturt had his curious little observation about the frog dance, but he never understood what it was and never interpreted it properly anyway. Some of the other people were trying to get a bit of a handle on it. George Gray, for instance, who explored most of the northwest Australian coast, Kimberley coast, was the first one to actually describe Aboriginal women collecting frogs from swamps. And you can see he describes them using their arms. They plunge in up to the shoulder in the slime. All this sort of stuff. And often he would see them with 10 or 12 pound weight of frogs in their bags. So they're collecting, you know, a substantial mass of frogs. Moore, much later on, actually describes Aboriginals collecting spawn masses for food, which is interesting because this is the only record that we know anywhere of Aboriginals collecting frog eggs to eat. So it's interesting. Next one. Gray. Okay, this is a different Gray. He was a naturalist. He was an English naturalist. Came to Australia as a member of the staff of the British Museum, and he was involved in collecting. Now we're in the period about the 1850s now, so he's actively collecting. The area that he spent most of his collecting time was in far southern Australia, so Tasmania and southern Victoria. So pretty well all of the reptile fauna and frog fauna and so on is attributable to John Gray. All right, we'll just keep going. He did do some trips inland and collected a couple of the inland specimens, but not a lot. Coming up to the 1860s, the name that pops up is Gerard Krefft. Now, Krefft he's one of these peculiarities. He drives people bonkers now. You know, back in the days when he was appointed curator of the Australian Museum, he drove people bonkers. And we still at this day, no one knows what to make of him. He was a bright guy, but he knew how to create enemies too. That's probably the easiest way I can describe it. Every member of the Australian Museum Board hated his guts with a vengeance, and he did everything he could to tease them, annoy them, be a pain in the bum, but he was a good scientist. And so he described a lot of mammal, reptile and some frog specimens up until 1974, when he was unceremoniously picked up out of his chair. They picked the chair up. The chair, him and Lot were carted out and tossed into College Street, and they said, "Don't come back." So, that was the end of him. And basically, he disappears into obscurity almost sort of overnight. So he's just a real curiosity, and yet he was a very good scientist, but he just clearly had no people skills and no political sense at all. Yeah, that's right. Next one. Okay, and then we have a big period where nothing happened. Frogs went right off the radar. So it's not until now, you get into the 1900s, that finally somebody starts to show any interest in frogs. And Joseph James Fletcher appears. Now another although he was Australian born, he was of English parentage. And he was very much a trained naturalist. He was educated both in Australia and in England. Came back to Sydney, realised straight away, people don't employ scientists in this country. You could probably say what's changed. So he ended up, he had no choice to make a living. He became a teacher, so he started working at Newington College in Enmore. And during that whole period, he started doing trips, collecting trips of his own. And then eventually he joined the Linnaean Society. And it was in the Linnaean Society that finally he was actually given the scientific direction that he really needed. And while he was originally director and then librarian of the Linnaean Society, he actually did the first ecological studies on Australian frogs. And up until then, nobody had done anything else other than pick them up, put them in a jar, take them away and describe them. So finally, you're getting to a point where somebody's actually sitting down to watch to see what these things do. And Fletcher, some of Fletcher's papers are interesting to read because he keeps saying, these are not European frogs. They do not behave like European frogs, you know. And it's a broken record. It just goes on every time he describes. This frog does this, totally unlike the common frog of England, which does this, you know. Oh. Yeah, so. And Marin would appreciate this because he was also the first person to get really interested in the embryology of them. Right? So all of a sudden now the science of frogology in Australia, if you like, is finally starting to take off in different directions. Right, next one. Arthur Loveridge. Now he was a British biologist. He made several trips to Australia. Everything he collected, of course, he took straight back to England and described, and it all went back into the British Museum of Natural History, but nonetheless he was still helping in the cataloguing of species. Stephen Copeland's an interesting one. We don't know a great deal about Stephen Copeland. We know he's Australian born, Australian educated. How he got interested in frogs is a complete mystery. No one seems to have a good explanation for any of this sort of stuff, but he decided that he was going to sort out all the tree frogs in New South Wales. Now, so where did that come from? You know, it all just seems out of the blue. So he financed a lot of his own trips, but in the end, he ended up getting support from the British Museum for some of the trips, provided that he sent specimens back to England as well. And so for quite a number of years, he just went out collecting. He would go to locations, describe all of the species that were in a particular location, collect subsets of those, and then he would start doing morphometrics. Now, up until then, morphometrics had never been heard of. In other words, doing very detailed measurements of different parts of the body as a way of distinguishing, particularly some of those species that might have been a bit similar to each other. So in 1957, he put out by far his greatest publication, as far as I'm concerned anyway, because he put out his definition of the tree frogs of New South Wales. Now, the one thing Copeland didn't have, he was a good anatomist, I'll give him that. He had that side of it down, but he had no idea of phylogeny. He couldn't classify, butter from toast. He wouldn't have a clue, right? So, shortly after this, Copeland's published this. Meanwhile, in the US, John Moore has read this and said, wow, great piece of work. What a pity the names are all nonsense. And so the American Museum of Natural History said, Moore, you go over and fix it up then. These people in Australia clearly, are a long way behind the times. They need sorting out. So the American Museum paid for Moore to come over and spend a number of years in Australia, going through Copeland's collection, going to places that Copeland went to. You can flick the next one. And basically to try and resolve the taxonomy, and which was good because the taxonomy up until then was still stupid. We still had a lot of rana, right? Now rana, the way that Copeland was describing it, are European frogs, right? So Moore fortunately was the first guy who was starting to sort this out. And of course he was the first one to say, well, when you seriously look at your frogs, you can see there's virtually no relationship at all to anything in the Northern Hemisphere. If you're looking for relationships, the closest you can find is in South America or in South Africa. Right? So you can see where he's coming from. He's saying ancestry here is totally Southern Hemispheric driven. Now, at that stage, nobody knew about Gondwanaland or anything like that at all. But Moore actually tries to explain this, and he has to invent what he calls land bridges for frogs to get from South America to Australia, because he didn't know the continents moved. And so he had to invent these volcanic land bridges that pop up and then eventually erode away, and so the frogs can't get back. And yeah, he could see it must have happened, but he had no mechanism. And it's really interesting to read some of this stuff. You can see the intellectual dilemma that this guy's going through, trying to explain what he's found. So great scientist, and he did a really good job. Pity he wasn't Australian, but anyway, there we go. Right, finally we do start to get some Australians popping their head up, and the first one is Bert Main over in Western Australia. Now, Bert was probably the first academic in Australia to say, right, it's time to get serious about frogs. It's time to really, really try and sort this out. And Bert's interest was, why so many species? This is a hot, dry country. It's got precious little water in it. You should have bugger all frogs, and you haven't. You've got heaps of them, and not only have you got heaps of them, but they are weird and they are diverse. The variations in the Australian frogs is far greater than you see across the whole of Eurasia. How come? Why? What's going on? It doesn't make any sense at all. Something's gone on here that needs explaining, and that's what he set out to try and do. Why did we end up with the frog species that we've got now? Now, Bert was good, and he was very insightful, and he started the whole field of zoogeography of Australian frogs. But he was a little bit ahead of his time, because had he come along another 10 or 15 years later, when genetics was really starting to kick off, he could have explained a lot of the things that he was barking at. But it didn't matter. He was paving the way. He was cracking the ground, if you like, to start to explain all this. Anyway, he was the first one to put out an explanation for why the southwest of Western Australia has the frogs that it did. And this is, again, it's worth reading, considering it's been done from a non-genetic point of view. It's very clever. Right, it's not right, but it's very clever. Right, and then we get an interesting amateur pops up, a big, tall, lanky Brit by the name of Michael Tyler. Now, Michael was an interesting character. He had relatively little formal training. He was interested in frogs. He was hanging around the museums and whatnot in England, realised there was very little opening for him. It didn't take very long for people to tell him, look, if you're interested in frogs, you're on the wrong side of the planet for a start. You need to get over into the Antipodes. And so he did come to Australia, ended up in South Australia, got a job just working as a technician in the museum there for a while, and very quickly demonstrated that he had not only a mad, keen interest in frogs, but he was prepared to do the hard yards on it. He didn't mind getting hot and dirty and all the rest of it. And so in those days, doing trips into inland Australia was a bit of a challenge. You know, there weren't the roads and things that are around now. And so he initiated a lot of studies into frogs. Yes, some of them were taxonomic, and he did end up describing a lot of new species, but he got interested into other aspects of the frogs. He certainly got interested in the biology of the frogs, but he also got interested into, and this is one of the areas where he's copped a lot of criticism, into the possible use of frogs. And in this, he started looking at some of the compounds that frogs actually create, what they produce. And once he got into that, he realised that some of these substances that frogs can generate actually have a commercial value. And so he involved himself in a number of joint projects with pharmaceutical companies and bioengineering companies to isolate, synthesize and manufacture some of these compounds. And some of that was highly successful, earned some companies some big dollars. He never seemed to get much out of it, which was, I think he can't have been much of a businessman, is probably all I could say. But he did also initiate some other good things. Probably from a biological point of view, he was the first one to actually start looking at using frogs as bioindicators, as ways of actually determining how good or bad particular aquatic systems were. And he found a way of graduating frogs. So you could come up with a better measure of the state of health of a river system or a water body using frogs than you could do with any sort of mechanical meter or laboratory test. He did do a lot of stuff on the impact of pollutants on frogs, and in particular looking at mutations and genetic change in frogs. And then later on he got involved in a lot of work on good old cane toads, like a lot. So, interesting guy. Unfortunately, his health is tragic at the moment. He's not doing very well at all. But he's left a big legacy in this country. He's also left a lot of enemies in this country. But I think we just accept, when you get somebody who's, pushing boundaries all over the place, that's going to happen. So.
Eccentric to the extreme, but highly intelligent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He's one of a kind, but but like everybody, he's not perfect. He had his imperfections. But anyway, great bloke. Anyway, just move on. I think I've got a picture there somewhere. There he is. So I checked back through his CVs, and I came up with 512 papers that he'd written, which I think is not a bad sort of an effort. And of course he's described stuff from not only Australia but New Guinea and a lot of the islands in the South Pacific and so on. So yeah, and I could only find one frog that was named after him, which was Latoria tyleri. Yeah.
Euphorallia tyleri.
Oh, tyleri, that's right. Yeah. Oh, is there? I haven't heard of that one. Yeah. Who did that? Is that recent? Okay. Oh, well, that's good because he yeah, he could have been. Yeah, he'd been most likely. Yeah, because he definitely needed more recognition than that, I have to say. But anyway, next one. So where we're up to now in the story is where I was sort of getting interested in frogs. So Tyler was coming up through the ranks, right? So as a teenager in Sydney, I'm hearing about this, tall streak of misery in South Australia, who's describing all these frogs and doing all this fantastic stuff in Central Australia. The scientific community at the time tended to look down on Tyler, partly because he didn't have much by way of formal training at all. And as I say, he could rub people the wrong way too. But the other thing that was happening shortly after that was in Melbourne, a group of 3 or 4 scientists were getting together to start looking at frogs specifically from the point of view of speciation, how frogs speciate. So this is coming back to the whole question that Bert Main was getting at. Why does Australia have so many frogs? And how did they do it? How did they actually achieve so many species in a relatively small space? And Bert Main was astute enough to realise that some of these species have only been around a very short time. And again, he did it without genetics. So Murray Littlejohn came in and he decided, right, well, we need to start looking at frogs in great detail in the field to find out exactly what's going on. Now, you are probably going to be shocked to hear this, but Murray was the first person to actually prove that frogs make a species-specific mating call. I mean, it's the most bleeding obvious thing in the world, but he was the first person to prove it, right? And so he had these little chambers set up where he'd have frogs of different species there, little recording boxes, and he'd be, female frogs, and he'd be playing calls of different species to them and recording the number of times they go to the right one and the number of times they go to the wrong one. And he was right into what they used to call then the bioacoustics. So what he then started doing was slightly varying the calls to see how far you could vary the call before the female would not recognise it. And once he started doing that, the twig, right, the penny dropped, the big penny dropped. Because all of a sudden he understood, if you wanted to produce a new species of frog anywhere, not in Australia or anywhere, all you had to do was change your call and have a female prepared to respond to it. That's all you had to do. Because from then on, you've created a genetic barrier. Right? And so he spent a lot of time getting into the fine detail acoustics of frog calling, looking within species, looking at variations in call across their range, particularly species that had long ranges, and some of the species, he was the one who discovered, for instance, that in some of the species that have long distributions along the east coast of Australia, for instance, like Nasuta, if you take Nasuta from the southern end of the population and then take them up to the northern part of Australia, or introduce them to the opposite sex from the northern part of Australia, they don't understand each other. Right? They're the same species, they don't understand each other because they're across such a big range. There's a little bit of change all the way along, and by the time you get up the other end, all of those little changes have added up to so much that they don't communicate anymore. Yeah, like people too, I think. Yeah, so Little John all of a sudden here said, I've found the mechanisms for speciation, right? And of course, once he started to quantify all of this, which is what he was very good at, of course he realised that you could produce a new species of frog in a matter of 250 years. You can do it very quickly, right? So then he started working backwards. He says, righto, I've got a number of species here that are clearly closely related. I can work out that, they've probably speciated, 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. Why? Oh, the next nearest neighbours in New Guinea, what happened at that period of time? Oh, Ice Age, Torres Straits exposed. Oh, I know what's going on, right? And so he was able to explain the genesis of many of the species of Australian frogs. Right? And it started out from just simply going around recording frog calls. So it was brilliant stuff. So when he was in his heyday, he and Angus Martin and Jasper Loftus Hills and all those crowd, when they were pumping stuff out, oh geez, it was good to read, because it was such cutting edge stuff for the world, not just Australia, for the world. This was really hitting high notes. Murray started in the 1960s, but he was still kicking along in the 1980s. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. And he's... Oh, okay. No, I'd like to hear that. Yeah. I wonder if we can get a copy of that. Is it? Oh, we should try that because he's such a. We should play it one night, maybe. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. He's such a spectacular character. Eh? Is that a photo from the Hoser Files? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Smuggled. Yeah. So an interesting guy, very quietly spoken, very humble, very modest character. His wife did most of the assistant field work with him. He did pretty well all of his recordings on reel-to-reel recordings, and she was the one who was sitting in the back of the van or on the table there with all the recording gear with the earmuffs on, trying to filter out all of the noise and rubbish in the recordings. And so she was the sound engineer for the whole time that he was doing this stuff. So it was a real husband and wife team. It was just fantastic. Right, next one. Oh, next big name to appear on the scene was Hal Cogger. Now, Hal obviously is much better known for his work on reptiles rather than frogs. But Hal is most significant here because he's the first person to ever take all of the Australian frog stuff together and try and synthesise it in one. So he tried to sort out the taxonomy, he tried to develop keys for frogs? What? This is unheard of, totally unheard of. That's the copy of the very first edition, that came out. And of course we're up to, what are we up to, 7 now? Edition 7? 8? Oh, I don't know. I've lost track.
Yeah, genuine hero.
Yes, he is. And it was again, another very modest, quiet-spoken guy, really, real gentleman of science. Okay, next one. Jumping from the 60s into the 70s, Queensland erupts on the map. Hooray, about time. We haven't heard a squeak out of Queensland up until now. And all of a sudden they come out with a number of luminaries really quickly. The first one was David Liam. Now David was interested in taxonomy and speciation, that sort of thing. Right on his heels, Chris Corbin, same sort of interest. These guys are all coming out of UQ, right? Glenn Ingram was shortly after appointed the curator of amphibians at the Queensland Museum, and he was bought into the same sorts of arguments, starting to look at particularly the unusual frog assemblages. So a lot of these guys started off working on the mountain frogs in Queensland. Why did you have these peculiar species, in many cases isolated to single mountain peaks? How come? Why aren't they in the valleys for a start? You know, and why do you go there and it's species A, there it's species B, there it's species C, there it's species D? How did that happen? So that's the sort of stuff they got interested in. Shortly afterwards, Bill Hosmer and Keith McDonald appear on the scene. Now, Keith in particular, Keith's a really good field worker, right? Tremendous field biologist. So you've now got really good guys in the field being able to field not only specimen material back, but really good observational stuff and being able to take good records in the field. So 1970s, 1980s in Queensland was an absolute, plethora of new species and ecological data starting to come out of Queensland, and it was so overdue. It was incredible. Other states like Western Australia, for instance, and Victoria were so far, they were leading the way up until then. New South Wales was a bit of a backwater. Once Copeland and Moore disappeared off the scene, New South Wales went to sleep again. All right, and now when you're coming up even more recently, Queensland's still going strong with John Mark Hero, Conrad Hoskins, and more recently still Ed Mayer. All right, so we'll kick on. And in the West, did Western Australia go to sleep? No, they didn't. No, Dale Roberts jumped in. He filled the vacancy when Bert Main retired. And again, he's concentrated solely on the Western Australian frog fauna. And it's interesting looking at Dale's work, where he first started off looking at biology and taxonomy and speciation in the Western Australian frog. Almost everything he does now is towards the conservation of those species, which is really good. So applying science back towards trying to actually protect the animals that he got interested in the first place, which is good to see. Right, next one. New South Wales. Oh, it's a bit of a question mark. Okay, yes, there was a hiatus here for quite a while, unfortunately, and really it wasn't until Michael Marnie got going. Michael Marnie, some of you would know, he has been to the odd FATS meeting from time to time. Michael's based up at Newcastle Uni. I met Michael when he was still a student at Macquarie University. And Michael got interested in the genetics of frogs. That's where he started off. It's one thing to look at how frogs physically change over time, but what actually happens internally? What are the relationships that are going on there? And can you actually explain these changes, how they actually occurred? It's no good just saying, oh, mutation, well, that's usually not the answer. It does happen occasionally, but there are many other ways you can speciate and change your genetics without using mutations. So he got interested in that. And of course, as he started to look at the weird and wonderful, particularly some of the inland species, Michael, of course, was one of the first who started to realise that a number of the desert species, particularly reptiles, not so much in frogs, but in reptiles, where it's very, very hard often to find a member of the opposite sex, you breed without them. So parthenogenesis becomes common in some species in inland Australia. You can't afford to wait for the other member of the sex. You may never see them during your lifetime. And you've still got to breed. So Michael, a bit like Dale, is spending a lot of his time these days working on conservation of frog species. And he's also involved in the Lazarus project, which I have talked about before. And the other one, of course, we can't forget is Marion, who's come on, because Marion's now added that other dimension to the whole picture, which was really ignored for so long. What happens during the juvenile stage of frogs? What happens during the embryology of frogs? And so, of course, she's put out her wonderful compendium now, and we're getting new data all the time on the development and the embryology of some of these frogs. So, if I think back to when I first started working on frogs, if anybody had said you can identify a frog by its tadpole, you would have got laughed out of court. You seriously would have got laughed out. And that was when there were only 50 species described.
I was doing really early stuff too, just while I was a music teacher, and my father helped me start off and some of those early guys. So
Yeah.
I did a few papers then, so it was really up because of their influence.
Yep.
That got us all going, and Murray Littlejohn, all of them.
It's interesting with a lot of this stuff, and Michael Marnie will tell you the same thing, that a lot of this sort of happens sort of in the background almost.
Yeah.
It's just people helping you along and nudging you along, and just, you got a bit of an interest, so you ring each other up and, yeah, and that's how it seems to really get going. So it's these people really who have given us the legacy of what we understand to be Australian frogs now, not just simply the 250 described species, but an understanding of where the frogs came from and where they're going, which is probably the more important thing at this stage. So I think it's an interesting history. It's not a planned history. It's just what happened. Yeah. I think that's it, isn't it? Oh, and the future. There we go. The future. Future has got to be in frog conservation. It can't be in anything else. And then I've just listed some of the people now who are involved in major conservation projects across the country. Now these are just some of them. These are the big projects that I've listed. There are a lot of smaller projects going on around the place. So some of them you would have heard about. For instance, Dave Hunter has spoken at the FATS meeting about some of the corroboree frog conservation work. Bill Buttimer, Phil Bishop and all of his students from Wollongong, similarly involved in corroboree frogs, but other species as well. Dave Newell looking at a number of the mixophy species and so on, so it goes on. So there's a lot of good stuff happening around the place, and it's up to organisations like us to let people know there's good things happening as well as bad, and to help these guys when they need help.